All right. Well, when either myself or Katie Halper goes on the Piers Morgan show, we at Useful Idiots are going to become a Piers Morgan recap show. And
the people
Katie,
demand it, Aaron. The people demand
people
it.
want it. Yeah. So, Katie, you went on recently and did a great job. You were debating Alan Dershowitz, right? And also Jonathan Conricus, the former IDF media officer who took part in the propaganda stunt at Al-Shifa Hospital. So I came back on Piers Morgan this week, and the other guest was Jonathan Conricus, the aforementioned Jonathan Conricus. And so what was funny is at the very beginning of the debate, Jonathan started out by saying, I promise I'm not going to interrupt anybody. And I hope, he's referring to me that we all adhere to that so we can have a productive discussion, which is so funny because the first time I was on with him, he interrupted me when I started talking and I had to fight to get a word out. But I was happy to hear him say that this time to commit to civility. And it meant that I could speak without being interrupted. So here is one of my remarks, just talking about, first of all, the shameful denial of the Palestinian death toll, which previously in the conversation Jonathan Conricus took part in. And then the issue of, who overall is the obstacle to peace. And you'll never guess what my answer was on that one.
Yes, on the issue of the death toll in Gaza, the State Department has long relied on the figures supplied by the health ministry. The only people who do not are people who are seeking to justify one of the worst crimes in human history, which is Israel's mass murder campaign in Gaza. If anything, the Gaza Health Ministry's figures are too low, because how can you possibly have a full accounting of the death toll when Gaza Strip has been decimated by Israeli bombardment and so many people are still buried under the rubble? So personally, I feel that even to debate this issue is to lose one's humanity, just as it would be to debate the death toll by the Nazis during the Holocaust.
I'm borrowing a Chomsky line there because Chomsky used to say that to even enter into the arena of debate with a Holocaust denier is to lose your humanity. And I feel the same way about people who are trying to deny the death toll in Gaza when, if anything, the death toll is far higher than what we know officially.
I want to address some other falsehoods. Jonathan said that Palestinians have walked away from all these generous peace offers submitted by Israel. Israel has never accepted the fundamental premise accepted by the entire world, except for the US, that Palestinians have the right to a state in the West Bank in Gaza. 22% of their historic homeland. The rest was stolen by Israel. That's why, for example, just take one famous case. Palestinians are often blamed for walking away from a so-called generous peace offer at Camp David in July 2000. That's the peace offer that everyone likes to cite for why Palestinians have turned down this prospect of a state. Well, even the Israeli foreign minister, who transmitted that offer, Shlomo Ben-Ami, he later said, if I were Palestinian, I would have rejected Camp David as well. That's because he recognized that the Israeli offer would have kept all of Israel's major West Bank settlement blocks that make a Palestinian state impossible without offering Palestinians an equal land swap inside Israel. So Israel's never given Palestinians an offer that even someone willing to make a massive compromise, accepting just 22% of their historic homeland, could take. So this idea that Palestinians have walked away from a peace deal, it's just used to justify mass murder and aggression. And that's why during the years of the so-called peace process, the years of the Oslo Accords, Israeli settlements doubled in the occupied territories. How is it you're going to claim you're offering Palestinians peace while meanwhile building up the illegal settlements that make a Palestinian state in just 22% of their homeland impossible? That's a contradiction that no one can ever answer for, because this claim that Palestinians have been offered a contiguous state is simply a lie.
Wow. I can't believe they didn't interrupt you.
Yeah, it was refreshing to not be interrupted. And when you're not interrupted, it's a lot easier to make your points because you're not fighting to get your point out. So I'm grateful they didn't interrupt me. And
yeah, I wonder if it's also because they couldn't really debunk anything that you were saying. Not that stops people from interrupting. In fact, that's often what they do, is that they can't engage in any substantive discussion, so they just have to shout you down with ad hominems.
Yeah, and for me, the point I was making is really important because you'll always hear that, oh, Israel, we've tried so hard to make peace. It's the Palestinians who have rejected our hand of friendship, but it's just not true. It's just a complete lie. That's why I didn't say this on Piers Morgan, but they can never show a map right? Like if it's true that Palestinians were offered this really generous peace deal that would have given them, this state in the West Bank and Gaza, which by the way is in itself grossly unjust because that's just 22% of their historic homeland. So you're asking Palestinians to accept something that's really unfair to begin with. But actually, Palestinians have accepted that because after so many years, Palestinian leaders have realized that this is practically their best chance at a homeland. So Palestinians have accepted this, including Hamas, by the way. But Israel can never show a map saying, here's where we offered them that. Because it doesn't exist. They've always insisted on keeping these huge West Bank settlement blocks that cut through the West Bank, that divide Palestinian areas from one another, that make a state impossible. And that's why you'll never see a map. If you do see a map, I guarantee you it's not true because none of these maps are ever submitted. The closest the Palestinians ever got to receiving a map, I'm not kidding, Ehud Olmert, the Israeli prime minister, this is in like 2007, 2008. He literally drew on a napkin the contours of what the Palestinian state would look like on a napkin. And he showed it to Mahmoud Abbas. And Abbas wasn't even allowed to take the napkin with him. So this is the map that Palestinians are supposed to accept. Something scribbled on a napkin that they can't even keep for themselves to like pour over. So it's just the whole thing. The whole thing is just such a joke.
And they love, what's the thing? Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. That's one of their faves.
Palestinians since the 1970s have been talking about accepting their own state. They made it formal in 1988, which is a long time ago. But Israel still, after all these years, is not even on board with a massive Palestinian compromise. Just 22% of their historic homeland, which is what the West Bank and Gaza is. And of course, now it's sort of moot because how are you going to have a homeland in Gaza? It's destroyed. Israel destroyed it. So even speaking now about a two-state solution, it's very antiquated. I still think it's important to talk about because it gives a lie to the Israeli talking point that they have accepted it. But still, it's Israel that has made it absolutely impossible, not just by refusing to have a peace deal, but by physically destroying Gaza and taking even more West Bank land every single year. I mean, this past year under Biden, we've seen more West Bank settlement building by Israel this year than in a very, very long time. So it's Israel and only Israel with U.S. support that has destroyed the two-state solution.
But Aaron, that wasn't the only issue you brought up on the show. You also talked about Syria.
We also talked about Syria, and this is where, it gets to be more divisive because, as I say on the show, the Syria issue is very, very divisive in the pro-Palestine movement. People who are all united around opposing Israel and what it does in the West Bank and Gaza have very split feelings when it comes to Syria. And I tried to reflect that in my comments while also talking about an issue that I've spent a lot of time on, which also is a common talking point to justify the U.S. policy of regime change, which is these allegations of chemical weapons use by the Syrian government. And I got to make a very rare acknowledgement in establishment media about a story that has been totally ignored, which is the OPCW cover-up scandal, this investigation into chemical weapons use in Syria that was censored. And this is what I said. In Syria, Mohammed Morandi, I didn't hear fear. I heard him say a lot of facts, including he pointed out that the U.S. knew from the start that the insurgency it was supporting was dominated by al-Qaeda. That's why Jake Sullivan wrote to Hillary Clinton, al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. They're also on the side of Israel, which arms some of these anti-government insurgents and treated them in their hospitals. Now, Syria is a very divisive issue and has divided people who support Palestinians. There are many people who cheered on the overthrow of Assad because of his authoritarianism. We have to think, though, people also cheered the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, but look at the means through which that was achieved, an illegal war that set off catastrophe in the Middle East. And in Syria, there are similar fears. The people who overthrew Assad, the leader is the founder of al-Qaeda in Syria, and a former deputy to the leader of ISIS, al-Baghdadi. His name is Mohammed al-Jalani. And under his reign, insurgent forces in Syria committed atrocities against minorities in Syria. So minorities in Syria are living in fear. And just one correction, Jonathan said that Syria, it's a given fact that they use chemical weapons. Those allegations, I know they're very widespread. They've been challenged, including by whistleblowers from the OPCW, the top chemical weapons watchdog, which investigated the last major case in Syria, the allegation of Syria chemical weapons use in Douma.
Their investigation was actually censored from above, which undermined the allegations lodged against Syria. That's just one example that these allegations, which are used to justify warfare and sanctions, need to be scrutinized, just as they were in Iraq, when it turned out that Saddam Hussein, yes, like Bashar al-Assad, was a brutal leader, a bad guy, corrupt. But the claim that he used, that he had weapons of mass destruction, was a lie to justify war and sanctions. And the same thing in Syria with these chemical weapons allegations. If we cared about them, we'd listen to the OPCW whistleblowers and the leaks that came from the OPCW and scrutinize these allegations that are always used to justify warfare and horrible things, and have helped contribute to the carnage now we're seeing inside Syria.
Very well said, but I almost don't recognize it because I'm so used to these shows breaking into screaming matches.
Yes, it was a rare moment of civility, a nice way to end the year after so much rancor and shouting, including on those shows, which sometimes can be very entertaining. Like, for example, when you sparred with Jonathan Conricus and Alan Dershowitz, that was really entertaining. So there's room for both.
I did call him a bully. People really liked when I called the Dersh a bully.
Yeah. But, it's important for me to not forget that a story like the OPCW scandal, which is documented in all these leaks from the OPCW, has been totally swept under the rug. If you read any corporate media story now about Syria, they mention chemical weapons allegations. They basically assert them as fact without mentioning the OPCW scandal. Totally Orwellian treatment of a really, really important story. And, as long as I'm doing journalism, I'll be on this story because it's very important. And just like Iraq WMDs, it undermines the claims that have been used to justify war. But now we're in a new phase of Syria. Now we're in the phase of the U.S. has won, but the winner includes al-Qaeda, or at least the former leader of al-Qaeda. That's who al-Jilani is. And what is going to happen in Syria is anyone's guess. I'm very sympathetic to anybody who's celebrating the fall of Assad, all the repression, all the corruption under his watch. That's all true, but no one is truly free without actual sovereignty, without security, and everyone's rights being protected. And the forces that Jilani commanded during the Dirty War did commit horrible atrocities against minorities. And it's after all this destruction, after Syria has now been flooded with weapons and militants from around the world, it's very hard to see how under these conditions a peaceful future is in store. But the least we can do is, now that Assad's been overthrown, the goal of the crippling sanctions, at least that's been achieved. And even though it's like the most cynical thing in the world to impose sanctions just because you want to overthrow a government, now that at least the government's been overthrown, at least this is maybe a chance for the sanctions to be lifted. As cynical as the policy is, the Syrian people never deserve to live under these sanctions. And that's just as true whether they live under Assad or now under Jilani. So I hope that those sanctions will be lifted.
Amen to that.